A very warm welcome to you all at the beginning of this new year. And I hope you all feel well and keen to listen to our special guest this evening, Dr. John Guthrie, Fellow of Murray Edwards College, University of Cambridge, and one of our experts on 18th century Anglo-German literary relations, with a particular emphasis on, Alexander Pope in German. Lenz, Pope and Satire is one of his works. But of course, we also know John Guthrie as a Büchner specialist, as well as a fine commentator of Friedrich Schiller's Die Verschwörung des Fiesco. And we also have learned a great deal from his investigations into the function of translation as part of Anglo-German relations, literary relations, cultural relations in the 18th century, with reference to Pope, but also with reference to Schubert's aesthetics of drama. Now, our ancestors would have probably, the German ancestors, I hasten to add, would have probably had particular feelings on the 18th of January. This is Reichsgründungstag, but we will not talk about this tonight. In fact, we will go to Switzerland. And we will discuss with John's crucial support Johann Jakob Bodmer's translation of Milton's Paradise Lost. In other words, we will go back to 1742. We will go back to one of the great networkers of the 18th century, not as network keen as Lavater, his great contemporary, but of course Bodmer together with his friend Breitinger. We know him as someone who challenged, as it were, French literary aesthetics, emphasizing English sensualism, as the jargon had it at the time. And in all of that, both Bodmer and Breitinger attacked the traditional aesthetics, French dominated by Gottsched. And in all of that, the translation of Milton's Paradise Lost was key, was instrumental. Just how instrumental, I'm sure we will learn from John, and I'm delighted to welcome you in our digital midst. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, please switch off your microphones during the lecture. At the end of John Guthrie's lecture, there will be time for Q&A through the chat, and both Jana and I will monitor this chat. But so much for now, and the virtual floor is yours, John. We're looking forward immensely to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Rüdiger. Thank you for setting the scene, and I can just bring up my slides. Yes, and I am indeed going to take you to the Alps for a short trip and talk about Milton's Paradise Lost in Bodmer's translation. Milton was the first great English writer and poet to become known during his own lifetime on the continent of Europe. And Paradise Lost, the first epic poem in English to be translated into any modern European language. Not long after Milton's death in 1674, there was an attempt in 1680 by Theodor Haak in Oxford to produce a verse translation of Paradise Lost, but it only got as far as the first 3 books and remained incomplete and unpublished until another writer, von Berger, published it as his own in 1682. It then goes quiet until the 1720s, when Bodmer, Johann Jakob Bodmer, began a prose translation of the whole poem, which he published in 1732 and subsequently revised, producing no fewer than 6 different versions over the course of 50 years. It is often referred to in the context of Milton's reception in Germany, but by the end of it was often referred to in the 18th century and read too. But by the end of the century, it was forgotten, not so much because better translations had appeared, but because interest in Milton had been overtaken by enthusiasm for other writers, especially by Shakespeare. Bodmer's translation remains the only prose translation of Milton's poem into German. It's little studied or appreciated today, and criticism and defense of the translation were an important aspect of the literary debate that erupted between Bodmer and Breitinger in Zurich and Gottsched in Leipzig. The debate raised large questions about the role of the imagination and what could or could not be depicted in literature and how it was to be depicted. Bodmer's translation itself has been treated, though it is generally sidelined by the discussion of these larger aesthetic questions. And Bodmer is remembered today rather as a writer on aesthetics than as a translator. My focus here is on the translation and its connection with the aesthetics particularly the aesthetics of the sublime. In 1967, Wolfgang Bender undertook a study of the first 3 versions of the translation and argued that there was a tendency toward tightening up of the syntax overall. This is certainly true, and it disguises, however, some of the similarities between the different versions, and Bender's argument in the second half of his article that Bodmer's motivation in undertaking the translation was really the exploration of these aesthetic issues repeats the familiar perspective that prioritizes the literary and aesthetic debate. So I think a new approach to the translation is needed. And recently, translation studies have provided new approaches to 18th century translations. To begin with, I want to return initially to the question of what motivated Bodmer to translate Milton and attempt to throw some light on the processes of translation and the finished product. Bodmer was drawn to English literature from an early age and had read a number of English authors in the original before approaching Milton: Locke, Sherlock, Defoe, Addison and Steele, and he came to Milton via the French literary journals in 1718 and via the Spectator in French, which did not, however, include Addison's papers on Paradise Lost, because the French translator considered that Milton's poem was too extravagant for French taste and just didn't fit with French culture. Bodmer then translated the issues of the Spectator dealing with Paradise Lost, which had been omitted, and appended them to his critical treatise on the miraculous, Das Wunderbare. It was his friend Lorenz Zellweger who introduced him to Milton in the original and provided him with an edition, Tonson's edition, in 1723. Bodmer knew of the esteem in which Milton's poem was held in England, that it was the pleasure and delight of the English nation, as he put it. Bodmer saw Milton as a quintessentially English writer, and English culture was beginning to appeal more than French, offering, it was thought, deeper and more serious ideas. Milton's political views had penetrated to the continent, and while his reputation as an advocate of regicide repelled many, Bodmer, as a Swiss Republican in the liberal atmosphere of Zurich, was sympathetic. While Milton's theology was severely criticized in France, Italy, Spain, and other Catholic countries, Bodmer, as a Swiss Protestant, implicitly endorsed the religious message and viewed Paradise Lost as an edifying and uplifting Christian poem. He engaged with the theological issues it raised, and particularly elaborated on in letters. Milton's religious ideas were readily transferred into the early 18th century German context. But Paradise Lost was not a homily. It was a work of literature that embraced Christian and pagan mythology. And for Bodmer, it was an epic, heroic poem, and consequently he supplies the subtitle Ein Heldengedicht to his translation. Bodmer was particularly attracted by the depiction of nature in Paradise Lost. And as a native Swiss, of course, he was conscious of the power and attraction of nature. Earlier commentators rightly stressed the context of Bodmer's reading of Milton, escaping from the streets of Zurich into the surrounding countryside to experience idyllic and uplifting nature. The depiction of nature on an empirical level struck a chord with Bodmer, but more importantly, on another level, that experience of nature was filtered through poetry, and in Milton's poetry was embedded the concept of the sublime. Bodmer's emerging conception of the sublime, which he elaborated on in theoretical writings, was the pre-Kantian notion, which had its root in antiquity, particularly Longinus. Bodmer concurred with Longinus that the sublime was a rhetorical device generating ecstatic enthusiasm and heightened feelings, and that the way of reaching it was by imitating the most celebrated authors who had preceded him. Translation itself was a form of imitation and creative aspiration. Bodmer admired the mind of Milton, the poet, and his attempt to achieve things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, and had said that there was hardly a higher summit to which the mind of man could raise itself. As much as he embraced the pictorial and descriptive side of Milton's narrative style and Lockean empiricism, it was Addison's notion of the secondary pleasures of the imagination that was crucial. Nature was filtered through the imagination, and the mind stood in relation to it as a free spirit. Bodmer conceived of Milton and of other great minds like Newton as free spirits. He admired Milton as a great poet who had created through his poetry the uplifting experience of the free human mind in nature. The characters that Milton created were examples of free spirits to Bodmer. Satan and the angels take the decision to depart from heaven themselves. Adam and Eve make their own mind up to disobey and accept the consequences of their actions. The translation itself is an attempt to experience that freedom through literature and to enable his characters, his readers, to experience it too. Bodmer sensed that the importance of mountainscapes in Paradise Lost, the frequently invoked mountainscapes. The poem, of course, famously opens with the invocation of the heavenly muse that on the secret top of Oreb didst inspire that shepherd. In book 7, another example, we find immediately the mountains huge appear, emergent, and their broad bare backs upheave into the clouds. Their tops ascend the sky, so high as heaved the humid hills. Mountains are a symbol of the sublime embodying man's aspirations, the poet's aspiration to achieve success and represent the awe-inspiring magnificence of God's creation. Their absence in Bodmer's actual writings and poetry, which Elizabeth Powers draws attention to, is not really so surprising given that German mountain poetry was only just beginning. Bodmer's translation of Milton compensates for the lack of mountain poetry in German. The presence of mountains in epic poetry was a point of difference, of course, with Gottsched, who believed that flat landscapes were to be preferred. Everything had to be flat for Gottsched. Everything had to be viewed as part of the rational world. But this was not the case for Bodmer. One cannot, of course, depict heights without depicting the depths. I'm just trying to catch up with my slides. I'm afraid I'm a little bit behind there. One cannot depict heights without depicting continues so low, down sunk a hollow bottom broad and deep. Book 2 of Paradise Lost opens with Satan, the fallen angels in hell. high on a throne of royal state which far outshone, etc. It is striking that how Bodmer early out singles out Satan as a character of great interest. With Adam, he is more interested in the theological issues raised. With Satan, nature is key. And Satan was the character with whom Bodmer identified. In Greifensee, where he began the translation, he felt as Satan did when coming from hell, burning with liquid and solid, where the frozen ice singed his fingers and the fire wrought with chilling effect. He came into paradise, the exquisiteness of which, together with Eve in her nakedness, almost made him forget that he was the devil. And in a letter to Zellweger in 1724, Bodmer quotes the passage describing Satan's entry into paradise and identifies with Satan. I'll just give you this in Bodmer's own words. Als ich aus der Stadt kam und auf das freie Feld, war mir zumute wie dem Satan, als aus der Helle, die mit flüssigem und gediegenem Feuer brennt, wo das gefrorene Eis die Finger versenget und kalt die Wirkungen das Feuer verrichtet, in das Paradies kommen, dessen Kostbarkeit und die nackende Ewe ihn fast vergessen machten, dass er der Mr. Teufel wäre. Ein jegliches Ding belustigte mich, das zusammengerechte Gras, die Sendkühe, das Schütteln der Nussbäumen und so weiter. In Greifensee fing ich spielend an, diese und diese Beschreibung aus dem Milton zu verdeutschen. So Hans Bodmer, the later editor of Bodmer's writings, compares this passage to the section in Paradise Lost where Satan admires Eve, and Milton draws a contrast between being pent up in a populous city and the pleasant villages and farms of the countryside. It is a striking pastoral episode that appealed deeply to Bodmer. The empathy which Bodmer feels for Satan is remarkable, I think, in an 18th century German writer, and the first of its kind on the continent, foreshadowing similar cases in the German Sturm und Drang later and in English Romanticism, which saw Satan as Milton's hero. Bodmer's identification with Milton the poet, even with his blindness and fame, the empathy with characters in his poem, and the depiction of nature and the role of literature in uplifting the mind were the mainsprings of his translation project. The task of translating Milton into German required massive empathy and engagement. Bodmer understood Milton's Paradise Lost not simply as a Christian doctrine, Christian poem, but as an uplifting work of literature through its depiction of nature and human agency. The sublime aspect of the poem, sublime, had to be, this was Bodmer's task, was to be naturalized and domesticated, because the notion of the sublime had not been present in German poetic writing before 1720. Given the enormity of the task he set himself, it is no wonder that Bodmer undertook a prose translation rather than trying to concoct a metrical version or imitate the Miltonic grand style in blank verse. Although the subject matter of Milton's poem is serious and elevated, and uses inversions and classical allusions are frequent, the iambic meter of the blank verse retains some of the qualities of ordinary speech. Prose, as opposed to the separate metrical units of verse, was not unsuited to the translation of Milton's style, with its long sentences and fast-flowing narrative, more so than trying to put it into verse. Elizabeth Powers, once again talking of the sublime in Bodmer's aesthetics, states that the heart-stopping power attributed to mountains and other irregular natural phenomena coincided with irregularity and the lack of symmetry in poetic language. One could depict the fall of Satan and his angels into hell, a place of utter darkness, fitly using metrical verse and poetic language inherited from the Baroque, or unembellished and realistically in prose. Bodmer chose this path. Moreover, he knew about the translations of Paradise Lost using German German verse and their failure to be completed, the ones I referred to at the beginning, correctly surmising that he would reach a wider audience with a prose translation. So this brings me to the translation itself and the scopos of the translation. Sorry, that's Elizabeth Power's comment there. And the scopos of the translation, this idea drawn from Lawrence Venuti's categories of translation theory. So the audience for which Bodmer's translation was intended. The phrase from Paradise Lost and fit audience, fit audience find, though few, hides the fact that although he had to fight with the censor in a difficult political context, the appeal of the poem during Milton's life and beyond was wide. Bodmer was conscious of this and stated in his preface to the translation of 1732 that the appeal of the poem extended to men and women of all classes, ages, lifestyles, and education. As the Enlightenment advanced in Germany, there was an increasingly energetic attempt on the part of writers and translators like Bodmer to reach a wider audience with ideas from abroad, particularly from England. And this had to be done in a suitably readable way. The choice of prose was consistent with the taste of reaching the taste of the reading public, which would eventually encourage a flood of sentimental and realistic novels. Here, in the early stages of that process of the democratization of literature, translators like Bodmer were trying to raise the level of literacy by translating a canonical work and into prose. Bodmer hoped that the take-up of his translation would not be confined to a small group of elite educated readers and poets like Klopstock, for example, who's one of the main poets that Milton influenced, to whom Bodmer was friend and mentor. And the mention of women readers is significant, I think. And symptomatic of the widened readership Bodmer envisaged is that in 1746 he placed Milton's Verlorenes Paradies and a number of other English books on a reading list for women, ein Verzeichnis, eine Frauenbibliothek. And on this list, the English books already outnumbered the number of French books. This was 1746, but he'd obviously already had this idea before that. So Bodmer, I would claim, was the first translator in Germany to promote the reading of a canonical English text, specifically for women. Bodmer was also writing for a Swiss audience, and this is reflected in the first translation, which was criticized for its Helveticisms, Swiss-German features. In the later translations, Bodmer's style changes to include more features of Upper Saxon German promoted by Gottsched. As Wolfgang Bender has noted, changes Bodmer made in the second translation contained oft sehr weitgehende Eingriffe in den Text, in Syntax und Wortwahl. Bodmer was adapting the syntax to make his translation more readable and accessible. The translations of the metaphors, as well as puns and Latinisms, remained, however, broadly the same. And Bodmer endorsed them as an essential element of Milton's style, and the evocation of the sublime, and by translating them into prose, he would be less likely to run into criticism for over-egging the pudding. This was another point of difference to Gottsched, who objected violently to Milton's seltsame Metaphoren und verblümte Ausdrückungen. Bodmer recognized that Milton's style was not in fact so heavily dependent on metaphor, but rather of rhetorical devices to narrate and persuade. As Bodmer returned to his translation again and again, it was apparent that he believed he had made the right decision by using prose, thereby widening Milton's readership. Considering that a few years before Paradise Lost had been placed on a list of banned books by the Pope, Bodmer was undoubtedly progressive in this respect. The chief hallmark of Bodmer's translation is its accuracy, fidelity, and closeness to the spirit of the original. This is no less remarkable given the fact that he began learning English actually with Milton. He sat down with a Latin dictionary, Latin English dictionary, and got the English word, found the Latin, and then he knew, of course, the German. The similarities between the different versions, however, I suggest much more noticeable than the differences. And the often remarked upon Swiss German features of the first version arousing Gottsched's disdain concern mainly orthography and pronunciation, or the occasional slip into a Swiss German gender. And the important features of the translation, such as syntax and word order, are broadly more similar than different. And this concern with accuracy and conveying meaning is shown by the introduction of the 1742 translation of the footnotes, the extensive footnotes to the translation, which is very much concerned with conveying meaning and precise meaning. They're often intended to explain and clarify and bring the reader to the author, and not to improve on the foreign text. This might be compared with the first translation into French, which was also into prose, but made many changes to accommodate French readers. I want to talk about a few features of the translation, a few more features of the translation now. Conceptual words like nouns and verbs are generally accurately translated from English into German. Bodmer having been painstaking in finding an appropriate word in German and not attempting to adapt or change the meaning. This can be seen by the way he changes certain words in later versions. For example, justify the ways of God to man is translated in the first version as rechtfertigen, den Menschen die Wege Gottes rechtfertigen möge, with its judicial ring, whereas retten in the subsequent versions is more compact and arguably more poetic, but vaguer. He translates the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste, initially with vergiftetes Essen, but omits this phrase altogether in 1742 and the 69 versions, so that the taste and flavour of the apple disappear and the idea of disobedience is more abstractly conveyed. Disobedience, however, is well translated with the biblical flavour of ungehorsam, and this might be contrasted with the abstract legalistic word in the modern German translation, des Menschen erste Widersetzlichkeit. The similarity between German and English sometimes helps. For example, when Bodmer was very keen on building on the similarities between German and English, for example, in the translation of puns, in the case of the word fall, with its double meaning of fall from grace and fall from heights, spiritual as well as physical, Bodmer chooses fall instead of Sturz. Him the almighty power hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky to bottomless perdition. Die allmächtige Kraft warf ihn von der ätherischen Bühne mit einem grässlichen Fall und brand flammend in das bodenlose Verderben hinunter. With these metaphors, Bodmer has no problem, nor does he stumble over Milton's synonyms and puns. its double meaning of the physical root of a tree and the source of suffering. As Christopher Ricks points out in his study of Milton's style, Milton often uses puns and wordplay as sources of wit to counterbalance the austerity of the grand style. And this can be well conveyed in a prose translation and well conveyed in a prose translation more than in a metrical translation, which can try to reclassicize or improve on the poetry. Bodmer also pays attention to the texture of individual words and conveys the color, the play of color, taking advantage of the similarities between English and German and their potential for alliteration and onomatopoeia. A couple of examples here involving the serpent. So talked the spirited, sly snake. Bodmer translates as so sagte die begeisterte, schlaue Schlange, or so glistered the dire snake, so schimmert die gräuliche Schlange. And Bodmer also sometimes, Milton uses changes between sometimes the serpent and the snake and gets a different flavor with the use of the shorter word. Bodmer also alternates between Schlange and Wurm. He uses the word Wurm for snake, der höllische Wurm, for variation. Well, these examples of individual words and phrases show that Bodmer was more often than not accurate and that his prose translation had poetic qualities. The process of domestication has been effected without undue violence to those qualities of the original. And indeed, there existed on the whole a large number of parallel concepts and cognate words in the two languages at this historical juncture. There are a few exceptions, a few examples of foreign words, words which didn't exist in German, but these prove the rule. Just a few examples here of key words in Paradise Lost, and to show what Bodmer does with them. For example, the word limbo, a word common enough in English today, not so much in German. It was attested before Milton, but not in the German language. Bodmer simply gives it as limbo, and its meaning is explained by the modifying phrase. In Milton, we have into a limbo large and broad, since called the paradise of fools. In Bodmer, we find in einen weiten und breiten Limbo das Paradies der Narren gedankt. This is the passage which Milton uses for satirical purposes. Pandemonium, another famous word from Milton, didn't exist in German. The meaning was clear from the context. Bodmer simply uses the word pandemonium, and meaning was clear from the context and the Greek root, of course. And indeed, it became better known in German after Bodmer's translation. I think this was a better solution than Germanizing or domesticating in that respect. He might have come up with something like aller Teufel Versammlungsort for pandemonium, but wisely chose the English word. Another foreign word that became domesticated through Bodmer's translation is Myriaden, although not very common in modern German. Here we're dealing with an English word that has been Germanized. So the appropriate translation of words like limbo, pandemonium, myriads helps to achieve the larger aim of domestication of the sublime, which, as I mentioned earlier, was foreign to German poetry. While these examples of individual key words and phrases are revealing, it's the broader aspects of style that have received more attention. What is at and its readability. And comparison of the opening passages, the first 26 lines in the 1732, 42 and 69 versions is revealing. The later versions are shorter by a few words, but the syntax remains much the same. The opening 26 lines contain but 3 sentences. Milton's sentences are comparatively long and flow majestically along beyond the lines. He uses inversions, frequently with participles, to vary the pace and create a retarding moment. For example, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, where he uses hyperbaton and the typical the participle phrase rather than a relative pronoun. These participle phrases are, of course, derived from an underlying sentence. Bodmer's first version has but 2 sentences. In 1742 and 1769, it is 3, so that the sentences are still longer than the original. He uses a large number of relative clauses, explanatory clauses, and result clauses. Where Milton's style is compact, Bodmer spells things out using fewer participle phrases, as in that example, as modifiers. Because of the different syntax of English and German, he is unable to make use of the stylistic device of inversion that allows Milton's poetry to achieve grandeur and emphasis. There's one instance in the opening passage of the use of the antecedent relative, was in mir dunkel ist, erleuchte, for Milton's what in me is dark, illumine, but he rejects this in later versions and generally avoids it and other types of inversion. The general effect is that although the sentences gather momentum and flow, they lack the retarding moments and majesty that Milton's style has. The register has been lowered. Bodmer achieves fluency and clarity and does not interfere with the meaning, even if it is at the price of creating sometimes and interrupting their flow. The effect is to lower the register, losing some of the majesty and the grandeur of Milton's style. Despite the lengthening of sentences, rhythm is not entirely lost in Bodmer's translation, and though it is irregular, it achieves something of the declamatory style, declamatory qualities inherent in Milton. An example is the opening of the 1742 version, which has a ringing, attention-seizing quality. Bodmer is also able to reproduce some of Milton's alliteration, as in the examples that I've just given, and this enhances the flow of the narrative and achieves some of the heightened effect of Milton's descriptive style. A short rhetorical question like, who first seduced them to this foul revolt, he gives as, wer beredete sie zu dem schändlichen Aufstand, omitting a word for first, which is hardly damaging to the sense. The answer to this question, the infernal serpent, is translated as der höllische Wurm, which is equally good and effective. As here in this example, Milton often uses elisions, as in the English. In the opening paragraph, there are 8 in 26 lines. These elisions are generally for the purpose of rhythm. Most of them are plain sailing and contribute to the overall effect. For example, heavenly muse or heavens and earth, where the elision is barely noticeable. Others, however, are difficult to pronounce, as in the passage above the Ionian Mount, or later in the poem, names like Uriel, which are meant to be pronounced as 2 syllables, which can make the reader stumble. It can sound stilted and archaic. This problem doesn't exist for Bodmer because he is translating into German prose, and thus he writes über den Aonischen Berg hinaus, 10 syllables instead of 7. The words have their own separate stress. The meaning is plain and there's no tendency towards archaicizing. modernized and domesticated, but in a gentle way. The style is changed, the register is lowered. There's no attempt on Bodmer's part to imitate the archaic features of Milton's style and to give the impression of antiquity and elevation, even though he admired this. Overall, Bodmer's translation implements fluent strategies, avoids syntactical fragmentation and polysemy and sudden shifts in discursive registers. These are the hallmarks, according to Lawrence Venuti, of a good translation. So, because of the lowering of tone and register consistent with the process of domestication, it may be thought that Bodmer did not entirely achieve his aim of providing an uplifting experience for his readership and creating the encounter with the sublime. Das Geschichte von dem verlorenen Paradies did not, however, read more like a novel than a poem to be declaimed. It had its critics and those who preferred a poetic translation, and the trend after 1740 would be to translate using metrical translations of Milton's poem. However, because of its accuracy and its sincere and sustained attempt to bring Milton to the German reader, there will have been those readers who sensed the importance of das Wunderbare and the newness of that experience. These are the qualities that Breitinger talks about in his Kritische Dichtkunst of 1740, Bodmer's collaborator. The sublime, which had originated in England largely with Milton, had been domesticated through Bodmer's translation, and this process had been enacted without the aim to improve on the foreign text or with undue interference from the translator or the imposition of cultural norms and values, the cultural norms and values of his own native language. Thank you.
Great. Thank you ever so much, John, for this very illuminating analysis of Bodmer's achievement as a translator of Milton's Paradise Lost. You emphasized quite frequently the lowering of register, and I think this is something which is most intriguing. And of course, the quote that you also showed us, Breitingers von den Neuen, der Poet muss sich nach dem Landesgewohnheiten richten. This is obviously something that has to do with this attempt to democratize literature. Is this something that goes sort of hand in hand? That would be my initial question and comment. And also, we of course know that Bodmer was very interested in medieval literature.
Yes.
And despite having translated Homer, at least in parts, he also is the one who really draws attention to medieval literature as something that is close to the vernacular, as it were. Do you see a correlation here between these two?
Sorry, you froze.
Ah, yeah, yes, you also.
Yeah, sorry, you froze there. I'm not quite.
Right.
I'm not quite sure if I caught all that. Yes, well, the interest in medieval literature and in the origins of German Swiss literature goes hand in hand with the opening up to English. And you saw Milton as I think this is the first example of seeing Milton as a representative of the English nation and of English culture. Yeah. And of course that leads later to similar view of in a much sort of bigger way to seeing Shakespeare as the representative English writer. But it's this opening up to English literature is very closely connected with his exploration of the roots of Swiss literature too, the folk literature. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, questions. The chat is open. And please, we have Kevin Hilliard, who's raised his hand.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful talk. I wondered whether I wonder whether I could use what you said, which suggested a certain tension between what you call the democratization, which went along with the lower register and the fact that it's in prose, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the attempt to persuade a German readership to take the sublime more seriously, which was certainly one of the main purposes of the Bodmer writing a team in a landscape which was that of the early Enlightenment, where the sublime really had not found a place. So there's a certain tension there, and I think you brought that out very clearly. I wonder whether one could even push that a little bit further, and that they were at I mean, he was working at cross purposes with his own aesthetic. Or is that pushing it too far?
Quite sure whether that's. I'm not quite sure if I'd follow you there. I mean, the sublime. You're thinking of the sublime is elitist and.
No. I mean, he doesn't think that the sublime is elitist, but the sublime is meant to elevate. And yet the style of the translation of this sublime work tends to bring things down to earth again.
That's true. Yeah. I think that there's certainly. I mean, there are certainly losses with translating into prose. On the other hand, by getting the meaning across accurately, he still preserves an element of that of the sublime, I think. Yeah. I mean, he of course the Milton's archaic style, elevated style with all these inversions, the grand style helps to achieve the sublime, and Bodmer's readers miss out on that. But still, I think there's an element of it that can be detected, through the substance, the meaning of the text. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from Ellis Griffiths, who thanks you, John, for a splendid paper, and asks, you mentioned Bodmer's battles with censorship in your paper. Could you tell us more about that, please? Censorship.
Yeah. Yes, I mentioned. Well, I mean, I mentioned at one point that Paradise Lost was banned by the Pope, didn't I? That was not in Germany, but in Italy, I think, and other Catholic countries. But Bodmer had a battle to begin with, because he found. I mean, he started this translation in the early 1720s, and it took 10 years before it was published. And he did have considerable difficulty in finding a publisher and getting the work, into press. But after that, it was fairly, plain sailing. But the difficulties were at the beginning. Yeah.
I mean, you said it, to have Satan as a hero is quite something. And one considers two radically different reactions, delayed reactions in a sense, to the Paradise Lost, with Klopstock, the Messiah, and shall we say what Blake did with it. Would you say that Klopstock's reading, Klopstock's reaction in the Messiah is in a sense remodeling, refashioning what Bodmer tried to achieve in his translation?
Yes, I mean he's giving his version of it. I mean he changes certain characters, and he's not so interested in the paradise, the fall from paradise. There's a lot more to Klopstock's story, and he's not so interested either in Satan. He has this character, other devil, and Ramalech, who is more sort of caricatured really, rather than the very powerful character that Milton's Satan is. But certainly, yeah, I mean, Klopstock is giving his version of the well, it's of a similar story, but not quite the same one. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Any further questions that we have? Not at this moment. We have Thomas Martinek. Vielen Dank for this very enlightening paper. Could you elaborate a bit on the function of the Latin translation you mentioned for Bodmer? The Latin dictionary, probably.
The Latin dictionary. Well, yes, that's the way he went about translating. He had a Latin English dictionary, and looked up the English word, which he found in Milton's text, and found the Latin, and of course then he got the thought of an equivalent German word. It's worth mentioning that. I said that Bodmer's translation was the first translation into German and into a modern European language, but it had already been translated during Milton's lifetime into Latin in England, and that was quite common with the classics. It gave them an extra status and proved that they were had made it, as it were. So I don't know whether Bodmer knew the Latin translations of Milton, but he certainly knew about them. Yeah, and of course Milton was steeped in the classics, and of course, and something I didn't mention is the Italy, of course, and the importance of Italy for Milton, and Bodmer sympathised with that too, much closer to Italy, of course, in Zurich. And
would you argue that this translation has a particular place also in the querelle discussion entre les anciens et les modernes?
Yeah.
Would you say this is definitely a move towards, for want of a better word, modernism?
It's freezing again.
Frozen again, sorry.
Yes, I didn't catch just the last bit. You're asking what,
is Bodmer's translation, from your point of view, a definite push towards les modernes?
Yes, definitely. Yes. I didn't make that explicit. I think you can see this debate between Zurich and Leipzig, as it's the last phase of the querelle playing out in Germany, and Gottsched, of course, saying that we have to, as a Francophile, saying that we have to follow the French and the ancients and stick to the rules and be classical and so on. Whereas Bodmer is very much Bodmer and Breitinger as more progressive and modern and experimental, I think, and allowing for the freedom of the imagination. I think that's very closely connected with the Milton translation.
Maike Oergel, thanks for a delightful paper, and asks, was there a political motivation for Bodmer to translate Milton, or was it mainly literary aesthetic interests?
I don't think there was really a political motive. I mean, I mentioned that he was sympathetic to Milton's politics, but and to the fact that Milton was promoted or voted for regicide. That didn't worry him. I mean, that in itself was progressive, but I don't think there was really any sort of Republican motive in translating Paradise Lost, because it's so richly, theological work. I think that's one thing that, of course, goes missing in the German translation, or at least the average German reader in Milton in Bodmer's Switzerland would not have picked up on the many political references that Paradise Lost has. Of course, it's written during the English Civil War, and it's been seen as, in some ways, as an allegory of the English Civil War, and it does have a great deal of political resonance. But I don't think that Bodmer was very interested in that. I don't think that really came across in Germany very much. It was much more the aesthetic, the aesthetic issues. Yeah,
because by the time Gryphius's play Carolus Duardus was almost forgotten, wasn't it?
Yes.
Just one further question, if I may, just a brief comment also. When we look at a very young poet coming from Germany to Switzerland, the young Wieland visiting Bodmer in the Bodmer house in Zurich. But it is not really Pope it's not really Milton they're discussing Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And arguably it was Bodmer who suggests to Wieland, take Shakespeare on board, but he does not suggest to him take Milton any further.
No.
Which is, I think, also interesting, because I mean, here he is with a young poet, the young Wieland, but seems to say, or seems to think, the future lies with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I find this quite interesting, actually.
Yes. I mean, Milton is a sort of a preparatory stage on the way to the emergence of Shakespeare and the emerging interest in Shakespeare. I don't think Bodmer translated himself any Shakespeare, but he certainly pushed Wieland in that direction. Yes, he doesn't have a lot to say about Shakespeare, actually, but it was there waiting. It was sort of following on from his.
So, right, partly frozen at this point, but there you go. Do we have any further questions, comments, reflections, thoughts, ladies and gentlemen? If this is not the case, then I can only thank you on behalf of everyone for this truly splendid and indeed illuminating paper that gave us a very clear insight into also the sheer methodology that Bodmer developed in his translation of Milton. Thank you ever so much, John, for this splendid paper. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. And I would like to invite you already for the next lecture in our BASF series of the Center. On the 15th of February, it will be our colleague from Notre Dame, William Donahue, Dresden, a matter of conscience. So I think this year's lecture series also tries to span the wings, as it were, in thematic terms, of what the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations stands for. So with that, thank you all very much indeed. Have a successful new year. And once again, John, thank you so much for your splendid paper.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming.